Hello friends, this video on Physical World Part 1 is brought to you by ExamFear.com. No more fear from exams. The topics which we'll cover in this lesson are: what is physics, scope and excitement of physics, physics, technology and society, and fundamental forces in nature. So let us start with what is physics. Physics is the general analysis of nature conducted to understand how the universe behaves. Or, in simple terms, we can say that physics is nothing but the study of nature and the natural phenomenon which we see around us. For example, let us think of any natural phenomena which we see in our day-to-day life. For example, the twinkling of the stars, which we see every night. Do you know what makes the star twinkle? Yes, there is a phenomenon called refraction in physics, which is responsible for this phenomenon. Now, not to worry, we'll discuss each of these phenomena in each of the chapters. Let us take another example wherein we see the apples fall down to the ground from the tree. So, do you know why? However, we are not applying any external force on the apple. But even there, we have physics playing a role there. Or, if you think of the beautiful rainbow which we see after the rainfall, even physics is there behind the formation of this rainbow. So we'll discuss all the phenomena related to physics one by one in each of the lessons as we go ahead. Now, when I talk of physics or science, it is very important to discuss what is a scientific method. Whenever a scientist does or gives a theory, he goes through a series of steps and then he finally concludes a theory or concludes an invention. So this series of steps together constitute the scientific method. Now we will see what are the steps that makes the scientific method. The first step is systematic observation. The second one, controlled experiments. Third, qualitative and quantitative reasoning. Mathematical modeling. And finally, verification or falsification of theories. You must be finding the terms really difficult, but we'll discuss each of them in detail and simplify them. So the first starts with systematic observation. In order to understand these steps, let us take the example of a story. We all know that the famous scientist Newton discovered the famous universal law of gravitation. But do you know how did Newton reach to the theory of gravity? We will see now. Once it happened that Newton was sitting in his garden having a cup of tea when he observed an apple falling down the tree. Now friends, had it been you or I seeing an apple falling down the tree, we would have just ignored and enjoyed our tea. But since it was Newton who very keenly observed the phenomenon and deeply thought about it, so what he did next? He went ahead and performed several types of experiments regarding this phenomenon in his laboratory. So we covered the 2 points. The first one was systematic observation, wherein Newton observed keenly that the apple fell down from the tree. The second one, controlled experiments. He went back and performed several experiments in his lab. The third one is qualitative and quantitative reasoning, wherein Newton used different kinds of valid and invalid data to reach to a conclusion. What kind of conclusion? When he performed experiments, he found that there was a force in nature which is responsible for making the apple fall to the ground. Now, in this step, he used different kinds of data to prove or to conclude what is this force dependent on. That is, on what factors does this force depend on. Later, what he did, he reached to the mathematical modeling. What is mathematical modeling? He reached to a mathematical derivation of the force. He defined the force of gravitation as something like G into m1, m2 by r square. Not to worry about such big formulas, because we'll study a chapter exclusively for this law of gravitation, where we will discuss this law in detail. I'm just trying to explain you what are the steps through which Newton went to reach his famous theory of gravity. So what we saw, Newton observed the apple falling down the tree. Next, he performed experiments in his lab. Next, he used different kind of data to show what are the factors on which this force is dependent. That is, he found it is dependent on mass and the distance, mass of the bodies and the distance between the bodies. And finally, he concluded that this force is dependent on these factors in this form. And after all this, he finally verified that his theory is correct. And it became the famous theory of gravity. Now friends, there is another term if you see here, falsification. Sometimes what happens is, whenever a scientist gives a theory, until and unless somebody else comes and proves it wrong, it is accepted as a truth. So the similar thing, because if you see, there is no theory in this world which is completely correct. There is some or the other flaws in all the theories. So the same was true with this Newton's theory as well. The Newton's theory of gravity was considered as a truth till many centuries. But a time came several years later when something called quantum theory came into picture. And then it was found that the Newton's theory or the theory of gravity failed at the quantum levels. So the quantum theory kind of falsified the Newton's theory of gravity. So now quickly discuss the steps again. So in a scientific method, the first step is systematic observation. That is, you have to observe something very keenly and very deeply. Second is controlled experiments. You have to perform series of experiments on that. Third, qualitative and quantitative reasoning. While performing experiments, you have to use all varieties of data to prove something. The fourth is mathematical modeling. You have to give a mathematical expression for whatever you conclude. And finally is the verification of the theory or the falsification of some earlier theory. So I hope the steps are very clear to you now. Thank you. Visit ExamFear.com to watch free educational videos, try free online tests, get the best quality study materials, study from the best tutors and mentors, and much more. Thanks once again.